listening to Overwatch League Daily, your daily source for Overwatch League news, scores, and more. Here's your host, KickedTripod.
Good morning, Overwatch League fans. Here is your Overwatch League Daily episode for April 13th, 2018. I'm Pixie, and today I will be hosting the show as part of our guest host series, where an Overwatch community member takes over the microphone and brings you an episode of Overwatch League Daily. You can find me on social media at Pixie on the mic, but now, on with the show. First, your 2-minute rundown brought to you by our supporters on Patreon at patreon.com/OWL Daily Show. This show is completely supported by fans on Patreon, and for just as little as $1 per month, you can help us continue to bring you your Overwatch League news, updates, and discussions 5 days a week. Starting off with Boston Uprising versus NYXL, Boston got off to a strong start on Volskaya, but from there the series started going the way of New York. Just when it looked like Boston would walk away with only the one map win, they took out Junkertown, tying up the series, before commandingly closing out Oasis to join the highly exclusive club of teams that have beaten NYXL. Following that up was Florida Mayhem versus London Spitfire, which got off to an explosive start with a time bank on Volskaya eventually turning into a tie. The time banks didn't stop there, with Numbani going to 1 as well, but this time it ultimately fell the way of London, and from there they went on to steamroll their way through Nepal and Route 66, closing the series 3-0. Last up we had Philadelphia Fusion versus the Houston Outlaws. Again, time banks were the order of the day, with Houston winning out on Volskaya and Philadelphia hitting back on Numbani. The stage was set for a close 5-game series, just like the last 2 times these teams had met, and the trend of Philadelphia closing out the series 3-2 continued as they picked up their 3rd regular season match win over Houston. And that's your 2-minute rundown. For tonight's matches, we have LA Valiant taking on Dallas Fuel, followed by San Francisco Shock versus the Shanghai Dragons, before finishing up with Seoul Dynasty versus LA Gladiators. Matches start at 4 p.m. Pacific. Today, I'm joined by Jake Zenox Brander, an Australian caster and analyst who have had on the show a few times now, to break down today's matches and talk about how it all went down. Let's get started. First up, we had the Boston Uprising versus New York Excelsior, with some new faces on both teams across the series. Starting off with Boston, this was our first time seeing Mistakes play this stage. How does the team look with him, in your opinion?
Well, firstly, it's great to be back on the show, and it was obviously a great series between Boston and New York. Personally, I felt that Mistakes showed glimpses of what he is capable of, without really doing anything overly flashy or having a massive impact. Nerves could have been a factor as well, with a lot of attention surrounding his performance. The camera was on his POV for the entire first minute of Volskaya. To highlight that, overall, I'd say he'd probably be happier with his team's win than his own performance, but there is room to grow for Mistakes, and I definitely think he will.
Map 3 saw a lot of substitutions for NYXL, with half of the team being swapped out. The win was pretty convincing for them on Ilios. Is this just the effect of bringing Pine in for Ilios and other good Widow maps, or was something more fundamental going wrong for Boston, or right for NYXL?
Well, obviously, New York's not so secret anymore, but it's still a secret weapon on control point maps is Pine. But, Mano on the Winston certainly performed admirably and helped create space, applied a lot of pressure as well that pretty much allowed Pine to just sit back freely, pick up a lot of kills on Ruin with his Widowmaker. But on Lighthouse, it was a bit of a different story. A lot of it was Sabiolbi, Mano was still impactful, and Jonak as well. That did a lot of the work, in my opinion. Pine was still a main target for Boston, and that did pretty much allow Sabiolbi to essentially run amok. And as well as Mano pretty much backing up his performance from Ruin. I thought he was just really good, and I think that highlight was at the end of Lighthouse, where he had that great primal rage to secure the point, knocking the Zenyatta off, and I thought he played really well.
Gamsu across the whole series was instrumental to Boston's success, with a whopping 61 eliminations. What's Gamsu doing to go off like this? Is he just that good, or is there something else behind his success?
Gamsu has always been a standout player for Boston, personally for me. I've always felt that Striker and Gamsu are the true star players that the team has to offer, and so it's not really a surprise to see Gamsu perform well. Obviously with the shot caller change for Boston, could this be a factor for his individual performance against New York? Who's to say, but I think what he has shown is that he's been very successful so far in the Overwatch League, and that he is just a really talented player, so it's no real surprise.
Both times these teams met in the past, it's been a 3-1 and then a 4-0 for NYXL, meaning today has been a big step up for Boston and their most competitive series against NYXL to date. It's also not the only series where Boston have performed better than ever this stage. What have the Uprising been able to change that's seen them having so much more success so far in Stage 3?
Well, practice makes perfect, possibly. I mean, before the match against New York, there really wasn't any changes to the Boston lineup, and a lot of people figured that Boston would be a low-tier team before the stage began. So I think they've just been performing a lot better with time, and together as a group. Improvements have obviously come about, and the question now is, with the addition of mistakes and a new shot caller for the team in note, will these improvements continue for Boston? I mean, obviously the result against New York implies that it will. So for the Boston Uprising fans, expect a really strong Stage 3.
Alright, well, on to Florida versus London. Once upon a time, this would have been a relatively painless 4-0 for London, and as much as London is still favoured, the draw on Volskaya stands as a great metaphor for how the matchup between these two teams stands today. Additions to the roster aside, what's changed for Mayhem since their troubled start in Stage 1?
I think with Florida, the biggest change is that they are more competitive in maps that they essentially lose. But, I can't sit here and say that they've improved as a whole, because they honestly haven't. They're currently winless with only one map win to their name after 3 matches in Stage 3. And with their next 2 opponents being Boston and Houston, I honestly can't see them winning either series. New pieces, but same problems possibly seems to be the case for the Mayhem. And I'm sure that they've got their eyes firmly set on the Shanghai Dragons, which is after their next 2 matches, as a real testament to show where they are.
Let's get more into the maps themselves now. On Numbani, Mayhem took a while to build up ahead of steam, but once they got going, they looked strong. However, once they were stopped again, they took a long time to get back underway. Are Mayhem purely reliant on momentum here, or is it more that London's defense takes that long to break down once it's set up?
Numbani is the sort of map that teams can get a real snowball going, especially during the streets phase of the map after capturing that first point. But once they get to that final stage of the map, it can become a bit of a struggle to cap that third point. And I think that's where, for a lot of teams, that momentum can break down. I feel it highlights both teams and sort of where they're at. London is just the superior team at the moment in terms of getting the job done and being more clinical at the important parts of maps like Numbani. But as I said before, this is where Florida has improved. It's basically an honourable loss, as they performed well, but at the end of the day, it still counts as a loss.
Once again, Control started off looking very close, but after the win on Shrine, suddenly everything fell apart for Mayhem, getting shut out on both Sanctum and Village. What stopped working for them?
Well, Florida's ability to win the point back was definitely their downfall. Even on Shrine, the one round that they did win on Nepal, they won that because they were able to win the initial fight and hold that up to 97% before eventually succumbing to the Spitfire pressure. And then, of course, they struggled to sort of win that point back. Eventually, they got it in the end after allowing London to get about 90+%. And on Sanctum and Village, they never won the initial fight in the first place, and so therefore they had to deal with London's defense, and London's ability to defend the point was obviously way too much for Florida to break through.
Generally, when these teams have played, it's been Philadelphia winning on Control, which they repeated again today. What are Houston lacking in their Control gameplay that's stopping them from beating out Philly in this game mode?
Generally speaking, Houston isn't obviously the best team when it comes to playing on Control. Whilst they've had some good games on the mode, in general they struggle, and it's mostly due to not having a top-tier Tracer or Genji. To make up for that, though, the Houston Outlaws employ different tactics to combat aggressive teams like Philadelphia, but they usually fall short in the long run. Carpe is also a control point god for Philadelphia, so it's no surprise that they dominate Houston on the control point maps.
The Junkertown defense for Outlaws was pretty one-sided. What stopped Philly from going off like they had on Numbani?
Well, Junkertown doesn't really follow the meta in terms of dive compositions at the moment, and so this does allow Houston to shine more brightly. It's really sort of their map at the moment, and without the stats in front of me, every time I have watched Houston play on Junkertown, they've performed exceptionally well, as it does suit their playstyle, and it was fairly evident that Philadelphia just didn't know how to get past the Houston tank frontline that they had set up. Plus, it is practically Jake's home. He is a Junkrat main after all.
Any final thoughts on this matchup?
Well, these two teams have gone the distance every single time they've played each other. And each time Philly just seems to come out on top simply because of their ability to win the control point maps. You know, if Houston can figure out a way to improve on control, they could possibly win this series matchup in the future. But until they do that, it's going to constantly go in Philadelphia's favor simply because of the tiebreaker map being on control. But it does have to be my favorite matchup to watch, though, and possibly a bit of a rivalry maybe brewing between these two teams. Now, you'd have to think that with Houston falling just short each time, I'm sure they're very eager to get a win over the Philadelphia Fusion.
Alright, well, that just about does it for day 2 of week 2. Thank you very much to Zenox for joining us. Go follow him on social media at ZenoxOW on Twitter. Tomorrow, KickedTripod will be returning as host as we continue to make our way through Stage 3 of Overwatch League. As always, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoy the show, then remember to show your appreciation by following us on social media and subscribing to us on whatever platform you tune in on. We have also just launched our sister show, Overwatch Contenders Daily, hosted by Lemon Kiwi, so go check that out too, and if you'd like to support both shows further, then do jump on our Patreon at patreon.com/OWL Daily Show. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again tomorrow for your daily dose of Overwatch League news, updates, and discussion.